Hi, my name is Julia Avila. I'm a PhD candidate at the National Institute for Amazonia, and I will present the work entitled Adaptive Management Strategies of Local Communities into Amazonian Floodplain Ecosystems in the Face of Extreme Climate Events. Also present with me, the researchers Charles Clemente, André Braga Junqueira, Tamara Ticketing, and Angela May Stewart. So when we talk about Amazonian forest, we know that it plays an important role for securing local, regional, and global hydric and climatic balance. The biome houses about half of the remaining tropical forests on Earth and a huge diversity of fresh water and terrestrial biodiversity, many species of which can be useful for medicine, construction, food, and others. And the Amazon is also home to 33 million people with different histories and cultures that involved in a complex landscape permeated by an extensive networks of rivers. Many of these human groups live in a deep relation with biodiversity and natural resources, which have enabled long-term occupation of these forest landscapes. Nowadays, changes in the frequency and intensity of extreme climatic events are occurring and are expected to intensify, affecting food security with subsequent social and political problems. So we conducted a study in the Middle Solimões River, Amazonas, Brazil, in two sustainable use protected areas, the Amazon Sustainable Development Reserve and Mamirawa Sustainable Development Reserve. We used semi-structural interviews to understand how ribeirinhos in floodplain and paleo floodplain are affected and how they adapted to extreme climatic situations. And the ribeirinhos are traditional peoples that historically inhabit the bank of rivers, streams, and lakes in Amazonia, dealing with the natural season variation of waters to organize their life and work. And we will present the main effects of extreme floods and adaptations developed by these local communities. The floods are part of the life of the Amazon floodplains and paleo floodplains, with an annual flood pulse defined by one clear flood and a reseason cycle. And before the year 2000, extreme floods occurred about once a decade, and since 2009 there have been 4 extreme floods, even greater than previous extremes. So all families have several strategies to deal with normal floods, which are being adapted in the face of extreme floods, and such that new strategies are also emerging. And the ribeirinhos have signs in their traditional local knowledge that mark the beginning or end of the flood period, large floods or drought years, and the beginning of the rainy or dry seasons, for example. In the current climatic situations, these season indicators do not work as they once did. The lack of predictability of the climate has several consequences for local livelihoods, particularly for agriculture. So local communities report losses of sweet and bitter manioc due to the fact that manioc cuttings are now getting cooked in the soil, owing to the higher frequency of heavy rains followed by hot temperatures. And in addition, when the floods start earlier than expected, manioc has to be harvested earlier before their roots are fully developed, leading to lower yields. So during normal floods, manioc roots are harvested when they're mature, generally as the water level approaches the planting area, and the flour is processing during ajuris, a local name to collective work, where several people contributed to the production of flour for their families. And during large and extreme floods, our constituents are affected all at once. It is difficult to organize the ajuris. Manioc processing needs to be rushed, but sometimes the water rises before its maturation period, which either yields poor quality of flour or prevents processing, and both causing important losses. Manioc flour houses are places used for the processing of manioc into coarse flour. Manioc flour houses in food plants are areas that can float annually and need to be rebuilt as water recedes. As a strategy, some residents build floating flour houses. And during extreme flooding, many farmers have their fields flooded earlier than expected, and at the same time they need to make flour quickly. Given the great demand, not everyone can use manioc flour houses, including the floated ones. Thus, the floating of the manioc flour houses is a factor that precludes the processing of the primary carbohydrate in the region. Some people know and use adaptations of the pre-Columbian techniques for storing manioc doubts for the preparation of flour when the water recedes. This process consisting of placing the peeled manioc roots in a tightly closed raffia bags and suspending them under the water but avoiding contact with the channel bottom, as we can see here in this image. About planting, because Ribeirinhos deal with annual flooding, they usually plant short cycle crops and short cycle varieties of manioc. Vegetables, spices, medicinal plants are all planted in elevated raised beds, often in old canoes, as we can see in this photo. No flood-tolerant root species are cultivated in higher area, which are little or not affected during normal floods. But during extreme flooding, the waters may rise earlier than expected, in addition to rising higher than normal, and it kills plants generally adapted to common season cycles. In the floodplain, 45% of all crops were affected in 2015, include fruits, vegetables, and manioc varieties. Many were lost or could not be replanted. And after large and extreme floods, Ribeirinhos give priorities to plants that have better survivor during floods, such as açaí de mato, guava, cachet. They also establish fast-growing crops relevant to subsistence as manioc, yams, watermelon, melon, papaya, and some cultivated temporarily in leased areas or their relatives' properties located away from the floodplains. About the causes of crop losses, in addition to plants that do not tolerate flooding, another factor that kills cultivated plants are waves, popularly called banzeiros, and any other action that disturbs root systems during flooding. To protect the plant root systems, they do not harvest fruits by climbing trees, and they also mention puddles forming during the rivers recede, and when the puddles are very heated by the sun, they cook the roots, causing the plant's death. An option for planting in the event of large floods is to create raised terraces in the backyard. It is circular terraces about 1 meter higher, as we can see in this photo, to plant trees above the expected maximum flood level. And annually, local residents bring seeds and seedlings to their homes or uplands to plant after the flood recedes. During extreme flooding, this intensifies and many residents store manioc cuttings in their floating manioc flour houses. However, during extreme floods, some plants die before producing fruit and seeds. And to help active seeds networks, In 2018, researchers and students from Technological Vocational Center of the Mamirawa Institute started organizing annual fairs for the exchanging of cuttings and seeds associated with the annual assemblies held by residents of the Amana and Mamirawa Sustainable Development Reserves. So our last topic is about fire. Kauishi is a popular name of a sponge that grows on the trunk of the trees in different Amazonian ecosystems, especially in seasonally flooded areas. So we can see here in these photos the kauishi, and with the rise in the level of rivers and lakes, kauishi crumbles in the water and spreads widely. And during the ebb of the floods, the sponge is deposited on forest vegetation, and because it's a higher flammable sponge, it facilitated the occurrence of uncontrolled fires. And local residents traditionally practice shifting agriculture in paleo floodplains, which consisting in opening areas of vegetation with fire while old agricultural areas regenerate. And in the context of extreme floods, experienced producers are more cautious with opening cultivated areas and in using fire when they identify the presence of kauishi. So, as extreme climatic phenomena are expected to increase in Amazonia, a greater dialogue is needed between social actors in the region as communities, institutions, and government agencies for the collective elaboration of strategies and emergency plans that support traditional ways of life. And as part of this discussion, greater sharing of local adaptive strategies that enhance the resilience of these communities in the current scenario are necessary. As specific examples, techniques for mass storage of manioc and caution with fire due to kauishi need greater dissemination.